Dale are a bit of a peculiarity in Middle-earth, as many of the kingdoms of men that have the finery of all the heavy armour and some of the more decorated aspects to the rosters tend to have Númenórean heritage, and all of the others, be it middlemen or northmen or even men from the east and the south, have a tendency to have a slightly more tribal aesthetic. But Dale stand apart from that. They have no associations with the Númenóreans, at least not anything significant, in the same way that many of the other good kingdoms of men within Middle-earth do, and yet they still have this slightly more civilised air to them than many of the others, and a lot of this probably has to do with their association with the dwarves and the wealth that has brought Dale at moments within Middle-earth's history. And the Bardings also have other neighbours as well, in the shape of the elves, of course, the Sylvan elves on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains, who they have had dealings with in the past as well, and of course a rivalry with some of Sauron's forces to the east. So they occupy an interesting position geographically in Middle-earth, and of course that was perhaps to their detriment in the War of the Ring alongside their close allies in Erebor, who we took a look at last time. And last time we also mentioned how Erebor and Dale, in a typical way for many of the factions that are closely associated with one another, kind of fit rather well on a team together. And we'll have a look at some of Dale's strengths and weaknesses and go into some of the reasons for why that may be. And the first, I think, is probably one of the most obvious, and that is the fact that Erebor had no archers. Dale, it is the main strength of their faction, specifically their heavy archers as well. When it comes to skirmishing back and forth with the enemy, Dale are one of, if not the most accomplished faction in the game at doing that, at least in terms of cost effectiveness, not in terms of brute damage. You'd have to look towards one of the elven factions for that. But when it comes to trading back and forth, having those heavier archers and managing to wear your opposition down from long range, Dale, arguably at the very least, are the very best at doing that. Certainly they can invest the most, I think, into playing that way in comparison to perhaps Arthedain and Gondor, who you would say are the other two that really do place a heavy emphasis on that. But I think it's the variety of this kind of skirmisher that Dale has, and you're actively pushed to go down that route as well, because many of their archers are also pretty damn accomplished in melee as well. So it gives you that multifaceted nature, so you can invest in your archers without crippling yourself too much in terms of your upfront strength. And speaking of which, kind of linked to this, but it also expands across the roster as a whole. Their armoured units are good, and again, this almost certainly comes from their association with their dwarven allies, but as soon as you get out of the entry-level tier of Dale's units, all of them are going to have access to good armour, at least in some capacity. Certainly as you go up into the upper echelons of their roster, this is going to be one of these standout things, which again is not too strange when you compare them to many of the other western/northern kingdoms of men. But again, outside of those with Númenórean heritage, it is perhaps a little bit peculiar, and also they go about things in a bit of a different way to those. Certainly stylistically as well, they stand apart from the likes of Gondor, Arthedain and Cardolan as well. And it's armour across all of their units, like I said, so across their halberds, across their close-up units, such as their heavy swordsmen and line infantry units. Also, armour upgrades are something that you can definitely indulge in with Dale. Again, not too strange among the kingdoms of men, but it just helps you boost your units just that little bit further. And it's one of the things that the kingdoms of men, generally speaking, are pretty good at, being efficient. Many of them achieve that through armour, and Dale are certainly no different in that regard, and indeed it is one of the hallmarks of what makes them what they are. And the final thing to mention here, I put it down to weapon variety, because they do have a number of, especially in terms of their infantry units, they've got pretty much all of their bases covered to a certain extent. They've got a very good unit of halberdiers, they've got a reasonably sturdy unit of heavy swordsmen as well for their damage dealing purposes, a perfectly serviceable complement of spearmen and swordsmen, which you would expect again in comparison to some of the other kingdoms of men. Also, they have access to pikes. They are one of the few factions in the game to have access to a pike unit and a halberdier unit, which is far rarer now than it used to be, so that is a bit of a feather in their cap also. And also at range, many of their ranged units, as we mentioned, do double as pretty decent in melee as well, and a lot of them do this in different ways. So for example, we'll get onto the roster later, but the Dragon Slayers are more of a shock force in melee, as you would expect, and also their other heavy archers tend to have sword and shields, which gives them that, again, that slightly defensive edge to them also. And they've got a unique artillery piece as well, with a unique infantry unit to man it. So again, you've got a lot of options as Dale. It's not the biggest roster, but what is there, they pack a lot of content into. But they do have some gaps in their expertise, as is the case with every faction in the game. And I think the main thing to note with Dale is that they do have fewer melee damage dealers. As much as they do have a lot of variety with regards to their units and the kind of weaponry that they use, the area I think in which they're most lacking is the ability to deal damage up close. They do have a unit of heavy swordsmen, as we've said, probably the most obvious way that they're going to be dealing damage, but they are a slow burn of a faction. They are the sort of force which, if you're the type of player who likes to be a little bit more defensive and wear your opposition down, then Dale are absolutely the sort of faction you should be taking a look at. But if you're the sort of player who likes to smash your enemy to splinters quickly with a lot of heavy damage, a big part of that is going to be your ability to deal a lot of damage in melee quickly, and Dale don't necessarily have the roster to be able to do that unless you build it in a very particular way. But generally speaking, they are a slower paced faction, and even in comparison to the likes of Gondor and Arthedain and the like, they've all got more options, I would suggest, in terms of dealing damage up close than Dale do. But again, like I said, Dale also have maybe a slight edge when it comes to wearing the opposition down with their heavier skirmishers anyway. Also playing into this, I would say, is they have more limited cavalry options than many of the other Kingdoms of Men. Many of the ones that we've spoken about already, Dol Amroth, obviously Rohan, Arthedain and Cardolan, all have access to a good variety of cavalry units and also a very strong high-end selection of cavalry units as well. That's not really the case with Dale, and again it kind of fits with Erebor, because Erebor have got a strangely decent selection of cav in support of their main army. Dale also as well, their cavalry is pretty much designed to make it so that all of their units on foot, their archers and their infantry, are safeguarded. Obviously the mounted earls are the main way in which you would do that, a unit of sword cavalry of course. They do have access to some, well, we'll get into the roster a little bit later on, but they do have cavalry. It's just the amount they have, and you're never really going to be domineering on horseback. It's really just an aspect of your army that is designed to make it so that you're not going to be exposed in that regard on the open field. But for the most part, you're going to be reliant on those archers and your various infantry units to try and secure you the victory. And finally, I think it's more of a wrapping things up kind of weakness, this. But Dale are perhaps overly reliant on their defensive abilities and wearing the opposition down. When the time comes to seize the initiative, they maybe aren't able to do so in quite the same way as many other factions can. Of course, every faction in the game is going to be able to, swamp forwards when they have the initiative and finish their opposition off. It's just how effective they're going to be at doing that. And Dale, on the open field and in a siege, whether they're on the attack or the defence, they are going to be taking that slower approach, and it's going to be quite a meticulous process for many a Dalian player to be able to pull victories off in this sort of situation. Again, they can make for a very good part of a team fight as well because of their ability to kind of push enemy forces around with their skirmishing. But again, if you are a player that likes to be a little bit more aggressive, then you're going to find it more difficult as Dale to be able to get what you want. But yeah, I think enough of that. We will now have a look at what Dale are all about on the grassy plain. So just about we have been able to fit all of Dale's roster within one phase of the grassy plain here, albeit only just with all of the armour upgrades that many of their more regular units have. It was a close run thing, even with the slightly lower variety of cavalry units perhaps that they have, which could have pushed them over the edge. But even in spite of this, they do follow very much a similar pattern to many of the other Kingdoms of Men, albeit their tiers are maybe a little bit more limited in terms of what they are. You have your basic units, your slightly higher tier units, then your elite tier units, whereas many of the other Kingdoms of Men have got a few units which can be in between some of these, sort of that tier in between Bodyguard and high-end units that are for more specialised troops, which Dale don't really have outside of perhaps one of their cavalry units, ironically enough. The rest, however, is much more regimented, and we shall start off with the kind of units that every human kingdom does have a tendency to rely upon, at least slightly, and that is going to be the Dalian infantry. You can see there in their previous guise as the slightly higher tier dismounted earls. Nowadays they are the standard men-at-arms that every human kingdom does need to rely upon, albeit very good value for money. Only 400 for a unit of these guys. Now, admittedly, you can upgrade the armour to bolster their effectiveness somewhat. Their baseline defensive stats are not too bad, albeit you do need to upgrade the armour to the point where they will be comparable defensively to some of the other Kingdoms of Men. It's really higher up in the roster you go, where some of that Dwarven expertise does really lend itself to bolstering Dale's armour a little bit more. But you can see as well, from the stats, defensively, again, that armour is, even with its upgrades, slightly lower than the equivalent Númenóreans to the south, although significantly higher than many of the tribal factions that the rest of Middle-earth also have around. But also the attack score. 6, again, it's okay in comparison to some of the others, but again, Gondor, similar, but defensively a little bit stronger, and also more numerous. And when you look elsewhere, some other factions, such as Rudal, for example, have got some good damage on them that Dale can't match either. So it is very much the value proposition that you're buying into when you utilise the Dalian infantry. Having 20 or so men less can be a little bit of a concern, but when you consider they only cost 400, that does give you a little bit more leeway when it comes to buying some of your more expensive units that you will be leaning on more as Dale. And as we get into their archers as well, you'll come to realise that many of the archer units have got similar capabilities to the Dalian infantry in melee anyway, so this is really just going to be the initial force that you have on the front line, and then Dale can sustain this kind of unit perhaps easier than most because of how many of their skirmishers are also good sword and shield combatants when the going gets tough in the late game. But yeah, reasonably cheap actually. I mean, you know, compared to some of the Orcish factions even, that is good value, and in comparison to them, the defensive values are notably better, so there is that going for them as well. Can be a very efficient unit, but even more so than most of the standard men-at-arms units from the Kingdoms of Men, perhaps. You can't rely on them to win you the battle. They will just be a base from which you can springboard from. Moving on, Dale also have a similar thing going on to the likes of Gondor and Arnor, where the spear units are slightly smaller in number in comparison to the swordsmen, albeit the gap is not quite as big. The Dalian spearmen have the same amount of numbers as the likes of the Gondorian spearmen and the Arthedain spearmen, and it's the similar sort of story here as well. Once again, as is going to be the case really for Dale as a whole, and we did mention this in the lead up, the attack scores may be slightly lower than many of their fellow Kingdoms of Men, and when you pile the spear malice on top of that, the Dalian spearmen are most assuredly not going to be swift at dealing damage. But as we've mentioned before as well, spearmen are good defensively, especially when you upgrade the armour on them to give them those plates in behind the capes that they wear. It can be a little bit colder in the north after all. But yeah, good armour scores, higher than that of the standard infantry. The shield score a little bit lower, but they do make up for this by having, you know, decent defensive skill. I mean, it has been known throughout some of the other kingdoms where perhaps the defensive skill is not quite as high as maybe you would expect it to be for this kind of unit. And again, they can make shield wall, as is the case with many of this kind of unit. They also have that bonus fighting cavalry, which is going to make them a valuable unit to have on the flanks in the open field, and also just in general when it comes to trying to deal with cavalry, because Dale do need units to stave that sort of thing off, and the Dalian spearmen are the most mobile of this kind of unit. But also you can see the jumping cost, 575 for this kind of unit, and it's far more in line statistically with what you would expect from some of the kingdoms to the west and to the south. But yeah, other than that, fairly unremarkable, as you would expect a regular unit of spears to be. An important unit for them as well, we did mention the fact that Dale have access to two kinds of polearm units, which does set them apart from many others. The Lake Town pikemen being their pike unit, basic in nature as well. I mean, as is the case with many of these entry-level units of pikemen, the stats are not amazing, but that phalanx formation is the great equaliser in that sense, and the Lake Town pikemen will very often be found fighting in tandem with either some of the higher tier infantry we've yet to see, or the standard Dalians that we've already seen. Obviously a good bonus fighting cavalry as well. Very often you'll see them at the centre of the line in an open field to sort of be that area denial device for enemy cavalry. The main problem that they will have in comparison to pretty much most of the rest of the Dalian roster is the fact that they're going to do very poorly under arrow fire. Much of the rest of Dale is built so that they can actually withstand arrow fire reasonably well across most of their other units, even their halberdier unit, which we'll get onto later. That is not the case with the Lake Town pikemen, however. Those gambesons are not going to suffice for dealing with even some more basic arrow fire. An armour score of 5 is low. The defensive skill is also very low, so once that phalanx formation does get breached, be it by something heavy like trolls or just through sheer numbers, they will fall away very, very quickly, even by pike standards, and they're not the quickest at dealing damage either. So again, much in the same way as Dale as a whole, you need to play the long game with this kind of unit and utilise them as that base so that other units can then do the heavy lifting when it comes to damage. But yeah, not too dissimilar to any other basic unit of pike that the game has to offer. The second phalanx unit, however, is probably the one that Dale are more well known for, the significantly heavier and also more expensive at 750 Barding Herd. Another one of those units which has remained completely unchanged visually since vanilla, but that's not too surprising. They've got that distinctive look, that heavy lamellar armour, sort of very bulky in terms of how they look, and that translates to their stats as well. The defensive skill is still very low, so if their formation does get breached, it can be a problem against some of the heavier hitting units of infantry that you're likely to be facing off against. However, the armour score is very high, and they do also have that minor shield value, which isn't going to save them against the best skirmishers that the game has to offer, but it will help them out just mitigating that damage, because ultimately, if enemy archers have a look at your army, this is going to be one of the kinds of units they want to get rid of, because ultimately it is a very solid frontline combatant. They have that phalanx, of course, they have that bonus against cavalry as well. In addition, the effectiveness against armour that halberdiers offer is also nice, and they don't have to worry about the fact that they don't have... many forces that have a halberdier unit don't have a pike unit. That's not something that Dale have to concern themselves with, so they can augment one another on the front line if you so choose to have that sort of double threat. Again, the attack score is decent as well at 8. Halberdiers will do damage a little bit more slowly than the equivalent heavy axemen, even though this is a bardiche, so you could use them in much the same way. But yeah, a very strong unit, and will be the basis of many a Dalian defence that you see. But when it does come to dealing damage, the two remaining infantry units are really the options that Dale have. The slightly more, well, the much more easily massable Dalian Swordmasters, who now are effectively the replacement to the Earls because they have the same armour that the Earls always used to wear. And you can see they've got good stats as well. The attack of 15, the charge bonus of 15, high total defence as well, you know, good armour. But the fact that they are a heavy swordsman means that their defensive skill is also high, very high in fact, at 16. Also with a little bit of a shield value, so again playing into that fact that even the units which traditionally maybe are not so good at sustaining arrow fire, Dale have that little bit of an extra defence to them. Makes them very, very difficult to skirmish down, even when it's a unit which is still, you know, supposed to be quite weak to them. They've just got that little bit of an edge. And yeah, 700 is not too much. I mean, a unit of heavy swordsmen does tend to be fairly expensive. 143 means there's not a huge amount of them, so you do need to look after them, because when it comes to dealing damage, you are somewhat reliant on a unit like this to give you that damage spike in melee. But yeah, big attack. You know, nothing really too special about them in other regards. They don't have any sort of fear or inspiration effects, but they are a very single-minded unit, and you know exactly what you're going to be utilising them for. However, there is also one final unit in infantry terms which is going to offer you, you know, if you don't use the halberdier, this is the only other unit which has got armour piercing, but the Dalian paladins are, you know, one of the more striking units of armour piercing shock infantry that the game has to offer. Again, they kind of combine the Earls and the Barding Herds aesthetic into one. The really bulky shoulder pauldrons and large helms with very large maces. It's the sort of thing which probably wouldn't look out of place in Warcraft in many ways, but again, these are the strongest of the Dalian warriors, so I'm sure that they are strong enough to withstand. They do have the inspiration and fear effects, so if you do want that you know, morale boosting effect in and amongst your front line, then the Dalian paladins are really the only option for that, outside of some of the archers that we'll see in just a moment. 1250 is again fairly par for the course for this sort of infantry unit. The effectiveness against armour is fairly obvious when you consider the kind of weapon that they're wielding. The attack score as well is huge at 30. The standard charge bonus of 15 also being baked into that. So if they can land that against an armoured unit, they're going to do damage very, very quickly, which is in stark contrast to much of the rest of the Dalian roster, as we've already said. 2 hit points, so they don't stray into that 3rd hit point, but as we've already mentioned, that's kind of the trade-off that you have. You either have armour piercing and 2 hit points, or no armour piercing, and you might get 3 if you're lucky, but to have both is not something that you will behold very often. and the Dalian Paladins do fall into the regular way of thinking for that. Armour score of 13 is very high, as you would expect when you look at them. Defensive skill is decent, not huge, but again, considering the armour-piercing nature of them, that again is fairly par for the course. But yeah, important part of the Dalian roster, that at the centre of the rest of their army. As long as you build yourself correctly, you should find yourself in a pretty good place against the right kind of force, and that armour-piercing damage spike is nice as well. Speaking of armour-piercing, Dale do have access to the River Patrol as well, a unit of basic javelins, which is always going to be useful, especially in a siege situation, because they're always going to be efficient, whether attacking or defending, especially attacking though. It gives you that little bit of close range punch as well, because the rest of the Dalian skirmishers are again slightly slower burn with one exception, but that's very expensive, so in order to be a little bit more efficient, this is the kind of unit that you're likely to see from Dale a fair amount. The defensive score is not bad actually, 14 for this kind of unit. The armour score is very low, again wearing those padded gambesons only in the same way that the Lake Town pikemen do, so because of the shield value though at 6, again, even this unit is not completely defenceless against enemy arrow fire. It really is only the Lake Town pikemen and one of the horseback units in particular that are super vulnerable really to enemy skirmish fire. The River Patrol as well, considering their cheap costs, I don't think enemy archers are going to be wanting to target them down that often, to be fair. I mean, the missile attack of 6 is not the lowest, so you are going to be able to do a decent amount of damage a little bit more quickly than perhaps some of the lowliest of the Orc skirmishers. Bonus fighting cavalry as well is nice, but these cheap javelins, in much the same way as the cheap pikes of the Lake Town pikemen, it's very much the same sort of thing across most of the factions, albeit the shield value here maybe does give them a little bit of an extra edge in comparison to other units of this tier, like the Ruffians, for example, or the Orc Javelins. Now then, getting into really the heart and soul of what Dale are all about, and that is their bowmen. The Dalian bowmen are the basic offering here, and you can see that based on their stats, it really isn't all that much different to the Dalian swordsmen, although the main difference here being there are slightly fewer of them, 143 only. They are a little bit more expensive as well at 550. But the missile attack is 7, so that means that you're going to be able to do just that little bit more damage on average than many of the basic archers from other factions, and that does add up. I mean, again, the fact that they stray into doing almost elven levels of damage based on the tier of archer, whilst also combining it with the human way of doing things, which is going to be piling on that defense and trying to play the efficiency game, especially when you consider that this, much like some of the units we're going to be talking about in just a moment, is a unit that you can upgrade the armour of, just making them that little bit more efficient when it comes to trading arrow fire. They can use sharpened stakes as well, as you know most archers can, but when you consider some of the other benefits that you're getting with that, and the fact that you're also retaining the benefits that many other archers have anyway, is a sign that it really does showcase and lay bare what Dale's plan is, really, their plan A. And again, 550 is not all that much for a unit that has 7 missile attack. I mean, that's only marginally lower than some other factions' rangers, and this is a far heavier unit, and 550 only. But if you want to have something with a little bit more bulk to it, then you are going to be paying for the Bardian Marksman, which this is probably the unit more than anything else which is going to showcase what Dale are all about as a faction. When you look at these stats in melee, again 148, but they're going to be better off in melee than many of the basic units. You have to get into stuff like the Barding Herd and the Swordmasters before you have something that's better. Also, you can upgrade the armour just to make them that little bit more effective again. Armour score of 9 and defensive skill of 9 as well. Nice little shield value just to help them as well in that skirmish fight. Missile attack of 9 is very high for a heavy archer. That is the sort of thing that you would expect from an elven archer, really, and again it showcases how Dale really prize archery above all other forms of combat, really. And again, the melee attack of 10, all very good. The only thing that you would say is a little bit of an issue perhaps is the fact that even though they are good in melee, they do have that slightly lower man count, so while they will more than hold their own, you know, they're not going to have the same sort of numbers as a dedicated infantry unit, especially not if you do use them for their initial purpose, which is skirmishing back and forth. While they will win many of those engagements, they will still take losses, and that will still harm their chances of later winning in the melee combat. But 750, a little bit more if you do upgrade their armour. But again, that's money well spent really for the kind of multifaceted expertise that you're getting from this kind of unit. And then to really hammer home your long range advantage, you have your 2 Bodyguard archers, starting off with the more defensive of the 2, the Dalian Royal Guard, another sword and shield infantry unit in melee, and again this really does come across in their defensive score. 30 is high for a unit that is not a dedicated infantry unit. Shield value is not enormous, but it's enough to really give them that extra edge at long range. Good armour, good defensive skill, a second hit point of course. This in conjunction with the Dalian Bowman and Bardian Marksman is, you know, a real wall of an archer force to deal with. I mean, the elves will be able to out-damage it, but they won't be able to be as efficient as Dale because of the armour scores that Dale do come with, and also the shields that many of their units also don. Charge bonus of 10 is an interesting one, I just noticed. But yeah, missile attack of 9, again, a little bit more defensive in nature. I mean, that's still very high, of course, but for a Bodyguard archer, some of them do tend to go a little bit higher, but the Dalian Royal Guard prize their defence, and again, that long game that Dale tend to play. 15 melee attack as well. The inspiration of nearby troops is nice because again it's going to keep those basic units in line. So even if you're facing off against a swarm of like poison arrows, fire arrows, or even in the late game when you're having to throw everything into melee, it's the sort of thing which can really make the difference in the long run. Nice looking unit as well. The blue colour scheme in comparison to the reds that the equivalent infantry units have in the Swordmasters and the Dalian Paladins. But then, if you want to be a little bit more aggressive, you also have that option. Another one of the armour-piercing archers that the game has to offer with their handheld wind lances, the Blackshot Dragon Slayers, a little bit more expensive because their damage ceiling is that much higher. Having said that, they are going to be, I mean, if you just compare them back and forth, the armour and shield, well, the armour and defensive skill score of the Blackshot Dragon Slayers is slightly higher, but they don't have a shield score. So they will be able to do more damage to enemy archers that they're facing off against, but if you do get outmanoeuvred, the black shots will fall away to enemy archer fire just that little bit quicker. Obviously, you know, it's all relative. They're not going to fall away that quickly because of the second hit point. They are more dangerous in melee as well, with a melee attack of 23. Again, they're a little bit more of a shock infantry unit in melee, really. They also cause fear rather than inspiration. But again, if you're committing them to the melee late on, that fear effect is also the sort of thing which can cause your enemy to buckle just that little bit more quickly. Missile attack of 13 as well, with a decent ammunition store. You know, the armour-piercing nature of those projectiles means that you're going to be able to hunt down units individually if you pick and choose your targets correctly at long range, much in the same way as we talked about with the Wardens of the North and the Temple Guard. The Blackshot Dragon Slayers are very much in that same vein. The main difference really is the fact that you can set the table with them, for them really, that much easier because the rest of your archer force can do a lot of the ugly stuff while the Blackshot Dragon Slayers get the nice job of taking out enemy generals and enemy high tier units. Again, you do need to use them correctly, but if you do, they can be devastating to your enemy, and it's harder to get away from them than the likes of crossbows, for example. Now the cavalry force, again, as we mentioned, they do have a more limited variety of cavalry and no bodyguard units in their cavalry force. So they may have 2 archers, which is more than most, but no cavalry bodyguards, which is far less than most. The standard Dalian cavalry, though, regular lancers are the sort of thing which we've talked about before, and this is Dale's example of them. Again, you can upgrade the armour by 1 level just to make them that little bit more effective against enemy skirmishers, which for this kind of unit is nice. The shield value, the armour score of 9, it means that you're not going to get whittled down quite so easily. Obviously the charges of 15 are also very standard fare. If you're able to play that long game with the skirmishing and make it so that your enemy is teetering on the edge of defeat, then a few charges from a unit like this is the sort of thing which can secure you the game. One thing that this unit is not going to be that good at, however, is securing you any sort of victory in a cavalry-on-cavalry fight. You know, you may want to bring them for that purpose, just for numbers alone, to support the unit that Dale had, which is designed to do that from the ground up. But other than that, they have the same hit-and-run style that many of these light to medium lancers of the human kingdoms have. If you look after them, then they will look after you to a certain extent, but again, it's not the sort of crutch you can lean on your cavalry as you can with some of the other human kingdoms. With Dale, you have to be a little bit more deliberate with them and maybe make do with a little bit less in terms of numbers so that the rest of your army can flourish. But having said that, at the basic level at the very least, these Dalian cavalry units will do the same job as many of the other human kingdoms cavalry will. It's just they don't have that high tier punch with them to the point where it's a little bit more difficult to utilise your cav force. But One thing that you do have is a good unit of sword cavalry to use a little bit more defensively. The Earls of Dale, they too have remained pretty much unchanged. I think they were called the Mounted Earls once upon a time. The Earls of Dale were the infantry version, but visually speaking, they are still the same. And again, as a sword cavalry unit, they are very, very adequate. They've got the, 800 is a fair amount to spend, but for a cavalry unit which is going to be as decent as they are at facing off against enemy cavalry, that's not bad. An attack of 12, which has that bonus against cavalry, is nice, but it's the defensive scores again where, as is the case with much of the Dalian roster as we've seen so far, where they do shine a bit more. They've got a big armour score, good defensive skill for when they get involved in that melee fight against other cavalry. The shield score as well, so enemy archers are not going to be able to push them around either, especially in conjunction with that very high armour score, which outside of the infantry bodyguards is, well, outside of the bodyguards in general, is not the sort of thing that you're going to be seeing. So again, to use them defensively, to make sure that your archer force and your infantry force is well guarded against enemy cavalry trying to harass your flanks or try and charge you right up the middle, that's exactly what the Earls of Dale are here to prevent. And for 800, I mean, it is a fair outlay, but it's not the sort of cost that cavalry heavy factions are going to be spending on their best units. So there is a possibility for you to be efficient there if you play your cards right. However, this is probably the example of something which is a little bit different. You remember the Grey Company from Arthedain? Well, Dale have the equivalent of that as well. The Athala Rangers are now a horseback unit, horseback rangers, with all of the strengths that comes with, and also some of the weaknesses. As we mentioned with the Lake Town pikemen, this is the other unit in the Dalian roster which is pretty vulnerable to enemy archers, which can be a little bit of a problem because obviously you want your Athala Rangers to have free reign of the field so you can rip your way through enemy infantry units with their projectiles. I mean, missile attack of 7 is actually lower than, or it's only as much as the basic Dalian bowmen, but they do have the body-piercing projectiles that rangers have, I do believe anyway, because otherwise this unit probably wouldn't be worth bringing whatsoever. The total defense score is, again, reasonably low. I mean, if they do get caught out by enemy cavalry units, the defensive skill will keep them alive. So you can cycle them back out and maybe use a unit of Earls to safeguard them. I feel like in a siege as well, because of the kind of damage that this kind of unit can lay down, that's probably where you're most likely to see them. It's the most unique unit, I would suggest, in the Dalian roster, in the sense that it runs contrary to a lot of what the rest of the roster is all about. But it does give them that extra, again, archer long-ranged option, which really does complete things, really, because they don't have the foot rangers anymore. But this is arguably even better because it gives them something a little bit more unique to utilise anyway. And again, it just gives you that really well-rounded, long-ranged force. And in many ways, it's probably the most efficient long-range force in the game. The Athala Rangers, maybe efficiency isn't what you would say most about them if they get caught out, but they have the highest ceiling, potentially, of any of Dale's long-range skirmishers, even when you compare them to something like the Black Shots, for example. But yeah, very intimidating archer force that Dale have, and that is what's going to be winning you the battle more often than not. And they also have a unique ballista as well, much like Isengard and Erebor, who are right next to them. The regular Wind Lancers. So the Dragon Slayers have got the handheld version. This is the full-sized one. Obviously, again, you can see that very similar to the Dragon Slayers, this time they're wielding the Bardiche of the Barding Herd a little bit more aggressively, so perhaps the other shock infantry unit that Dale do have, again though it's unique to the artillery piece, but you'll be wanting to use the Wind Lance first. Again, a recruitment cost of 1,000 is not huge. Isengard spend a little bit more on theirs, but again, the ballista, when you're on the open field, it's a little bit more useful than some of the splash damage based projectiles. It's not got as high a ceiling in a siege because it doesn't do the same sort of heavy damage that a catapult or a trebuchet or a mangonel will do, but it is more reliable, and I think that's the key. When you combine that with all of the archers that we saw previously on the defence, when Dale dig in and they have the ability to fight the long game, as we've said several times now, the Wind Lance really just helps them in that regard, and when they're dug in they can be very difficult to remove based on their strengths. And when we cast our mind back to what Erebor are good at as well, the two factions do interlock very nicely with one another, because Erebor have got that short range punch as well as a little bit more damage dealing expertise in melee, as you would expect from the dwarves. And when they fight alongside one another, it's no wonder that they were just about able to weather the storm in the War of the Ring. I don't think we've actually seen the Wind Lances fully in action yet, so hopefully we will see that in the near future as well. But that's it for Dale. We'll wrap up here for the Northern Kingdom of Men. An interesting force. I feel like if you're the sort of defensive-minded player that likes to dig in, even on the open field, and really just try and outlast your opponent with bloody-mindedness, using your archer expertise and heavy infantry to effectively put on an impenetrable line for them, and then watch as they slowly flail against your defences and ultimately falter as the game goes along, I feel as though Dale are going to be a faction that you're going to enjoy playing, and also you don't have quite the same risks associated with playing that way as you might do with an Elven faction, for example. You may not have the high-end damage potential or the ceiling that the Elves can ultimately reach, but the risks are lower with Dale. I think Dale are a little bit easier to play in that regard. You could argue not much of a plan B depending on your composition, but it is what it is. But I think next what we will do is go back over to Sauron's side of Middle-earth, and considering where we are and considering who was facing off against Dale and Erebor in the War of the Ring, it makes sense to look at another iconic force of Third Age over the years next, and we'll take a look at the Easterlings of Rhûn. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for that.